So without further ado, let's dive in and invite Rikesh Shah onto the stage for our first talk today. Please help me join me in welcoming Rikesh. Have a seat. Anywhere. So thanks so much for joining us today, Rikesh. Firstly, if you could just tell us a little bit about yourself, your background, and how you became head of the Innovation Procurement Empowerment Centre.
Sure, thanks, Sophie. Thanks for having me here. I'm the head of the Innovation Procurement Empowerment Centre, which sits within the Connected Places Catapult. I've been there for a year and a half now. Initially, it was founded by Sam Markey. Previous to that, and I'll talk about what IPEC does during the session, but previous to that, I was the head of the Open Innovation team at Transport for London. One of my big frustrations was there are some brilliant suppliers out there, but we're not unlocking value from them. In fact, we're sometimes just innovating the same old way. Again, we can talk about that, but it's a pleasure to be here.
Great, thank you so much for joining us. And you've touched on it already there, but we're hearing a lot about innovation in government at the moment. Why is unlocking innovation specifically through supply chains so critical for UK businesses and government alike?
Yeah, so currently in the UK, we're spending around £400 billion a year on public procurement. If we think about the overall cost of the state, it's probably close to 1.2 trillion. So it's a significant amount of spend. But despite that spend, we've got incredible challenges that need to be addressed. Right now, the climate emergency is front of mind. We've got challenges around health. We've got challenges around social care, and child services. The list just goes on. Talking to some local authorities across the UK where they're making real binary decisions about which service to close down or reduce. So we're really desperate to solve challenges. It's not a nice to have. And that means that with advances in technology in particular, the barriers to entry for suppliers to come in has reduced significantly. And the types of suppliers that are coming in now are very different to the types of suppliers that were coming in when I was in the industry 20, 30 years ago. So right now, if we go to Shoreditch, just up the road from here, you could get a couple of individuals running a big business supporting cities across the world. So you could have lots of startups, you can have large scale-ups, you can have big accelerator programs now, that's like the CPC. You can also have open innovation programs through corporates. So the point here being is the supply chain has diversified significantly. So we've got all these challenges. There's a hypothesis that needs to be challenged, which is when we're stuck with those knotty problems, do we have to do everything ourselves? Because sometimes what I've seen, and I've seen it with my own organizations, is when we're stuck and a politician says, address it, the instinctive reaction is, let me get 6 or 7 bright people and let them sort the problem out. And then when you're still stuck after not sorting the problem out, you will then go to the market. And then what you do with the market traditionally is you'll over-prescribe what you want. So there's an inherent bias that I know what the problem is and I know what the solution is. And I think we need to do it a different way, which is how do you use the market by co-creating, co-developing, and being much more vulnerable with the problem as early as possible, and let the market come up with new ideas. And I saw that firsthand. We released our open data at Transport for London. And we got the data out there and we started to share some of our challenges. We got 17,000 developers registered to access our data. The apps like Citymapper, Google Maps, and some of the other ones, they were solving a problem. The problem they were solving is how do I help people wayfind across London? TfL wasn't best placed to do the wayfinding. They were best at designing transport services. And that's just one example, just through the use of data, as to how you can drive value from the market.
That's such an interesting point, and I think it's something we touched upon yesterday, because I know we were having similar conversations. How can we encourage those in procurement departments and procurement processes to more deeply understand a problem before jumping into a solution? Because there is a process thing there, because you think of procurement, the first thing you think about is writing a specification. So how can we start unlocking that potential and changing the process to allow those kinds of conversations to happen?
Yeah, it's a complete mindset shift, and I think, quite often, if we think about the political process, someone says something to a senior leader, and says, "I will deliver this thing for you by Y." So let's say if it's a 4-year term that a mayor has or a senior government minister has, immediately in year 1, you're saying, "I'll deliver this for you, and I'll do it by February next year." So you've already defined a time box. And that means that you've already started a procurement process, potentially. And what you will do is you will know what the idea is, you're desperate to solve it, so you won't go out to the market and do pre-market engagement. You won't even spend enough time on defining the problem if it's a knotty one. because the causation could be something completely different to what you think it is, and the solution could be completely different as a result. So I think immediately we sometimes trap ourselves by saying, I will do it by this date. And then the project plan is already delivered.
Yeah.
And then you're starting to look at those milestones. I think what we need to do is spend much more time up front to say, what is the problem that we're trying to solve? We talk about design thinking or service design. That's not a nice to have in my view. That is really by understanding what the challenge is, who are the stakeholders that are affected by it, really being open as possible initially, and then narrowing on what perhaps the solution might be. And that requires a culture change for policymakers, that requires a culture change for service owners, to say, you know what, when someone senior says to me, what's the problem and what's the solution, I might say, I'm not sure.
Yeah.
I need to do a bit more thinking. And then once you've done that work, go to the market, use the pre-market engagement process, and see what ideas the market's coming up with. Then you define your specification. And I think at the moment, we don't leave enough time for that early stage.
Yeah, that's so interesting, because I think the world I've come from in technology innovation, I mean, you ask any developer, they do not want to give you a deadline because they spend so much of their time in that upfront process, really wanting to discover the problem and also connecting with the audience that they're solving the problem for and asking them. And I think that's where real success and innovation has happened in the tech world.
Can I just come on that one?
Yeah, of course.
Because one reflection is, again, going back to my Transport for London days, we used to call end users, or we used to call them passengers. And there was a big shift when we started to call them customers. Because when they're customers, actually, they're people, right? And you're serving them. There's a role to be played. And that meant that how do we start bringing that end user in that design process?
Yeah.
And if we think about London, there are 31 million trips made every day in the city. Some people might have an accessibility need, some people might be going to school, someone might be going to the hospital. So many diverse needs. Someone may want to use the bus, someone may want to use a tube, someone may cycle. How do we start bringing that perspective and building that relationship with the customer, building that trust to say, you know, that service I'm giving you is actually relevant for you, and I'm not forcing it upon you, and I'm not just moving people around, I'm actually moving customers around, and actually I'm trying to satisfy you as a customer.
Yeah.
I mean, maybe moving around in transport isn't always satisfying, particularly for commuters, but how do you give it that best possible experience that they can have, rather than saying, I've done my job, which is I've just moved you around and I'm being measured on operations and performance rather than customer value.
That's such a good point, and I'm so pleased that you brought in the measurement part there as well, because again, we've been speaking about this, but you know, there's been a lot of questions recently around, does innovation work in government, does innovation work in local government, and we don't really know what does it work means, because how are we measuring the success of the innovation we're driving and the outcomes we're delivering? So have you seen any examples at the moment, you know, a blueprint of measuring the right outcomes to drive the right behaviours?
Yeah, I think innovation is much more than that front-end process, which is, and quite, you know, when you run accelerators, they're great.
Yeah.
And you launch an accelerator, but it's much more than saying we're seen to be innovative. And we're seen to be trying to do the right thing. Ultimately, it's the impact that you're creating at the end.
Absolutely.
So if you've invested some effort up front, in 5 or 6, 7 years' time, what benefits have been realized? And I think some of the things that I've seen are organizations now are thinking about this much more, which is if I invest £1 in innovation, what's the return that I'll get back in 7 years? And much more of a balanced portfolio approach. And I think, just touching on the open data work, we evaluated it, and every £1 million we spent, we got 130 million back.
Wow.
42% of Londoners were using an app powered by TfL data. And it allowed us to use people like Citymapper and many others to be our market partner, to move people around London. And that created new economic growth for those businesses because they were creating new jobs. So suddenly London's ecosystem of sort of mobility app innovators started to create additional value. So I think that was one example that immediately springs to mind, which is by investing £1 million, we got 130 million back.
Okay, I'm really having that kind of return on investment conversation is so helpful, I think. So you touched on data and measuring impact there. I mean, what are some other ways that you think we could be better using data to improve our procurement processes at the moment?
Yeah, and there's lots of talk about data and AI at the moment as well,
Yeah.
Particularly recently in the press. And I think there's 3 or 4 ways. I think the first one is, how do we use data to better drive transparency? So how much money is being spent on innovation at a local authority? How much is being spent at a regional level and then a national level? And then secondly, where are the opportunities? Because I think with data and AI now, we can start finding identify opportunities where you might be able to define or develop different procurement strategies. And I think there's an opportunity there if we do the right recording at the beginning and then through the contractual stage and then the benefits realization, we'll get a wealth of data, and that allows the government or the public buyer to make better decisions on how can I bring different forms of innovation to the problems that I want to solve. So I think that's one, so be that intelligent client.
Yeah.
I think clearly the second area is through the use of data and AI now, we'll get new types of products. You know, as I mentioned, the barriers to entry are lower. So as a public buyer now, we need to make sure we're making all that data available, so that whoever's creating that innovative product through the use of AI and data is as good as it can be.
Yeah.
And the third area is we've got to be careful now, because people are now putting bids through that are using AI tools. Public agencies might be using AI to get procurements out. So how do we make sure we do that correctly from an ethics point of view?
That is an incredibly good point, and I think you touched there as well around how can we share best practice and how can we use data properly. So have you seen some really good examples of where things have gone very well and you've seen a really good impactful outcome from your spend, like you were talking about with the TfL? How is that shared amongst other government decision makers so they could you know, kind of follow suit and look at that blueprint for what works really well? And do you think that could be done better?
Yeah, I'm really encouraged, you know, following the Procurement Act. You know, Minister Gould has just announced the Commercial Innovation Hub. And that directly links to the government's 5 missions. And I think that's the right way of doing it, to say we've got 5 really difficult missions that need to be addressed. How can we use the Commercial Innovation Hub now to better define problems, create the right data so we know what the actual problem is, and then work through the process of scouting the market, energizing the market, and then using the right procurement process to trial, to test, to learn, and then grow. I think that's certainly the right way. And I think, you know, full credit to the government, because they're saying there are areas we're stuck.
Yeah.
We don't know what the answers are, and we want the market to come up with some of those ideas.
Yeah.
I think to give you a practical example, we ran a challenge in London called London Road Lab. And the idea there was to reduce the adverse impact of roadworks in London, costing the city about $2 billion a year. And I remember running that procurement process where I said to the procurement team, I want to create a level playing field. So we applied what's similar to the competitive flexible procedure that's coming out, that's out live now. It's called the innovative partnership procedure.
Yeah.
And what my procurement team said, well, if you want to create a level playing field, here's the procurement documentation. And we looked at it and I said, look, the insurance cover is ridiculous. You know, the barriers to entry in terms of your accounts for the last 5 years are too high. And we streamlined that procurement process so it genuinely created a level playing field. We ran a series of R&D trials across London on the A406 and some of the other busy roads. And we had 10 very different ideas, and we ran a 10-week trial where we provided £20,000 for the innovator. But the beauty was at the end of it, we got some good ideas, which we procured through a multi-million-pound contract. And answering your question directly, the business case was every pound we invested, £3 got back in terms of value. So that was the business case that justified us scaling the procurement. And the ideas were stuff that we wouldn't even expect. You know, one of the ideas that came through was it scouts social media, and it looks for water leaks, keywords, key event types, key pictures, and it goes back into the control room. So TfL was able to respond to an incident much more readily. And the other one was it was ingesting data, and it was modeling roadworks, and as a result telling the utilities when's the best time to carry out a roadwork, rather than some of the challenges that we see. So brilliant technology, hadn't even heard of it before, and now it's adding value for London.
That's amazing, and I think this touches on something we were talking about yesterday as well. It seems that because all of these innovative solutions are out there now, it is actually more risky to not be looking at them than it is to just be staying the same, because we'll be falling behind. So with that said, what do you think the appetite of the market is from the supplier side to get involved in these projects? Because obviously historically they have faced barriers, and it's potentially been a harder point of entry or a harder commercial offering for them than it would be selling into the private sector.
Yeah, I think it's a challenge on both sides. I think on the buyer side, I think the public sector just needs to get better at shaping markets. And that requires using the procurement teams in the right way, because I think procurement colleagues are brilliant. But sometimes they're boxed into this thing of your job is not to get challenged, and your job is to make sure that we get value for money.
Yeah.
I think the new Procurement Act very much talks about the most advantageous tender, not the most economically advantageous tender. So I think there are challenges there on how do we better shape markets.
Yeah.
I think on the seller side and the supplier side, a couple of reflections from me are, whether you're a startup or whether you're a large company, engage with the customer. And don't spread yourself too thin. You know, there'll be startups that are constantly, you know, running around trying to build relationships, and it's not easy. You know, if you want to work with someone like Transport for London, there are 30,000 staff directly, and there's probably about 100,000 indirect staff. You know, you could be talking, there'll be multiple buyers. So really do your research around who is it that you want to engage with, why, what's the stakeholder map for that organization. And if you think it's not worth engaging with them right now, move on to the next one, because your runway is limited. So I think that would be the first one. I think the second bit of advice is, it's really nice to see the pitch decks, but if you're getting half an hour with someone senior, ask them what their problems are. And think about how you can really help. And how do you convert your narrative into something that's relevant for that buyer? And then what's the next steps afterwards? That buying process you will not sell in that first meeting. What does that process look like over time? And I procured stuff where I might have met the person 5 years ago. And then I said, now it's a good idea. So how do you build that relationship and build that credibility? So I think there's a translation issue.
Yeah.
You know, to get a meeting in a large public agency, it could take 3 weeks just to get internal colleagues aligned for a meeting. If you're a startup, what might happen is that evening you might call up and say, can we have the meeting tomorrow?
Yeah.
So how do we make sure that there's an understanding from both the buyer side and the seller side, and hopefully you find a sweet spot.
And find a really positive way to connect those two problem solution. So it would be great if you could talk a little bit about the work that IPEC do to try and drive those connections and to facilitate some of this through procurement processes.
Yep, so the Innovation Procurement Empowerment Centre is fundamentally there to empower.
Yeah.
It's there to empower the buyer side, so strategically, what's the right culture that you need for innovation through procurement to work? Because you might have the right intent at a service owner level, but if your chief finance officer or a chief procurement officer or a CEO says this is too risky, because I have to deal with the media, I have to deal with politicians, I have to deal with other stakeholders, immediately your instinctive reaction will be, thanks for doing it, we're innovative, but you know what, it's too hard.
Yeah.
It's too risky. So how do you create that right culture that if you fail, don't worry about it, I'll give you air cover. I will create the right entrepreneurial culture in our organization. So I think that's one. I think on the mission side, there are so many challenges that we've just touched on that the public sector faces. What IPEC is doing is we're embedding resources into public sector teams. Right now there's a call open, so if you're from the public sector, we've got our latest call open, share your challenges with us. And what we're doing, we've just done it with Westminster. We're embedding resources, whether it's a user design expert, whether it's a procurement expert, change manager, an economist. We're embedding that resource into public authority teams to give them every possible chance of addressing that mission-focused challenge that they have by baking procurement in. We've got the University of Birmingham here. That's our strategic partner, as well as the University of Manchester. We're building evidence to say, where does innovation through procurement work? What value is it creating? But also, where are the barriers? So you've got that independent research, which we're using to engage with government and others to change policy.
Yeah.
So there's lots going on with IPEC, and please visit our website and give us your thoughts.
Amazing, thank you. Before I go on to the next question, I was just going to look at Slido to see if anything has come through there. I don't know if there's any questions from the audience. Okay, there's a couple here. So when budgets have to be spent on a certain year, how can we take the time at the outset to get it right? So how do we create that space and time at the start of the process that we don't necessarily have at the moment, I guess, to get that right?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think one bit of advice I would give is sometimes with these innovation procurement programs, it might not be a 1 year thing. It might be a 3 year thing, it might be a 5 year thing. So have a word with your chief procurement officer, because now again through legislation you have to publish your procurement roadmap. So what procurements are coming up in the future. So if there's something coming through in year 3 and you've allocated through your business planning round £5 million, let's say, the question I would ask that service owner is, perhaps could we do it for 4 million? Or could we achieve better customer outcomes? And if you think we can, the instinctive reaction is we can, well then let's start that work in year -1, year -2. And really build the evidence to say there's a new way or a different way to do this. And then write your specification as per the program plan to deliver it in year X.
Yeah.
So I think in some instances, it doesn't have to be done just this year. Think about what future procurements are coming up, what contract renewals are coming up, and what type of innovation could you bring in.
Okay, amazing. And the next question I love, because again, we were speaking about it yesterday, but innovation procurement sounds like we are trying to procure innovation, but it's much wider than that. So even fixing potholes could be done in innovative ways, which we were talking about this yesterday. I think everybody's mind jumps to technology and AI when we speak about innovation, but it could be just making a process better. And do you think that's the kind of attitude at the moment, or are we still thinking about technology, AI, in more of that kind of purest sense?
Yeah, again, a great question. I can say it now, I don't work there anymore. But when I was at Transport for London, I had a massive challenge with my engineering and tech and data folk, because they thought quite often they owned innovation. You know, they said innovation is this new whizzy, shiny thing.
Yeah.
And we had to redefine what we meant by innovation. And I said, you know, even if you're a customer service assistant at Bank Station, you have absolutely as much right as anyone else to be innovative in the organization. And that's a mindset and that's a culture. And fundamentally, innovation is about value. It's about better outcomes. And so that could be a change to my job. It could be a process change. It could be a product change. It could be something technology. But it doesn't have to be. And I think the more we think entrepreneurially in our job, which is how can I do it better? And how can the market potentially help me? It might be an internal process change. It's about continuous improvement. It doesn't always have to be radical, transformative. But I think it's that mindset shift of we can always do better. And I think with that £400 billion, how can we squeeze more out?
Yeah.
Well, actually, it's not 400 billion, 1.2 trillion. How can we squeeze more out?
Yeah, okay, thank you. Next question is, to be innovative, you need to be confident. How can we help instill confidence into public sector procurement?
Yeah, I think it's giving that air cover. I think a lot of it's around leadership, a lot of it's around culture and values and behaviours. And I think where I've succeeded most is where I've had someone on my executive committee to say, well done for getting that wrong. You know, because you pushed a boundary. And you've just given us some insights there that could have affected another procurement in the future. Yeah. So I think quite often it's about having that advocate at a senior level that's giving you air cover. And then pushing the boundaries. I mean, in the public sector, sometimes we create these Excel spreadsheets that go up the reporting chain. And we do our best to make sure those spreadsheets are green when it comes to the red, amber, green status. And I used to say to my team, we'll manage that upwards, but let's be honest, and let's see a few more reds. And what that did is it allowed them to build the confidence to say, you know what, I can push the boundaries here because I won't get in trouble. So I think it's how do you bake that into your processes?
Yeah, absolutely. And get some change champions in your senior leadership team that are going to support that and encourage that. We have a question here. Are there other countries that procure innovation more effectively than the UK? And if so, do our public leaders recognise that they can learn from them?
Yeah, I see someone in our room that's doing it really well.
I was thinking that.
Without putting Anne on the spot, you know, Flanders is doing it really well. You know, they're really thinking about advocacy from all the buying community within the public sector. I think Finland is doing it incredibly well, where there's a culture of entrepreneurship, there's a culture of failure's fine, there's a culture of baking procurement at the beginning. But I think fundamentally it's 4 or 5 things. You know, I think firstly it's about that political air cover. I think secondly it's about baking procurement in as early as possible and assume that it will be successful, rather than doing this stop, start, because that's not good for anyone and you lose momentum. I think thirdly it's about saying what are the right problems where innovation can help. Because sometimes if you're buying pens, you say, well, let's stick to the same way, and that is based on cost. And then I think it's about having that right tenacity, right level of tenacity, because innovation is not easy. Yeah. It's a change program. You're bringing something new into your business. So you need the right advocacy, you need the right tenacity to drive it forward.
Absolutely. And I think that's something you see with change management across the board. So maybe this hasn't been seen as a change management process, it's been seen as a policy, and then you know, how are we helping to facilitate that change management as well? I've got one more question, probably the final question now. So how is innovation best funded within an organisation? We currently struggle with innovation being funded within individual projects, leaving less incentive to innovate as the benefits won't affect the particular project.
Yeah. Again, a reflection from me is that, you know, there's a couple of schools of thoughts. One is, do you create your own innovation team that sits outside of the mothership, and you have your own budget, and every so often you come back and say, here's another idea? It's really hard to plug that in, because what will happen is the mothership, people in the service owners in the mothership are saying, I've got enough going on, and every so often you're coming up with new ideas, that's just giving me a headache. But on the other hand, you could be part of the organisation. But then when you're part of the organisation, you've got to deal with the governance and all the other things that go with it, which is it will slow you down, you won't be able to be creative, etc., etc. So I think you've got to find that hybrid solution. And that's what we've tried in the past is we used to bring secondees into our team. So they become the problem statement owner. We'll get advocacy, so sponsorship might be from a director from a particular area. And we'd get them to put some money in as well. Because the easy answer is you create your own team with 50, 60 people, or whatever the number is. You've got millions of pounds in terms of innovation fund. I think there's got to be skin in the game for the service owners within your organisation. And you create a hybrid type team. And that, I think, will be much more effective in terms of potential to scale.
Okay, amazing. Thank you so much for your time, Rikesh. That was
Pleasure.
some amazing insights there. So,
Thank you, Sophie. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
thank you.
Thank you.